The summer of 1936 in Spain began like any other, but beneath the surface, the nation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Streets in Madrid and Barcelona buzzed with political rallies, while rural towns simmered with resentment toward landlords who controlled vast estates and left peasants in grinding poverty. The Second Spanish Republic, established just 5 years earlier, had promised a new era of modernization, social reform, and democratic governance. Instead, it became a flashpoint for conflict, its ambitious reforms exposing the fault lines of a country divided by ideology, class, and culture. On one side were the Republicans, defenders of the elected government, a coalition of socialists, communists, and anarchists determined to protect democracy and push for progressive change. On the other side were the Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco and other military officers, who saw the Republic as a threat to tradition, religion, and national unity. What began as political tension quickly spiraled into a nationwide struggle that would engulf every corner of Spain and draw the attention of the world. Spain's troubles were not sudden but the culmination of decades of economic inequality and political instability. In the southern regions, vast estates latifundia dominated the landscape, with impoverished peasants working under harsh conditions and receiving little to no compensation. The north and northeast, particularly Catalonia and the Basque Country, experienced rapid industrialization, which created a vibrant working-class culture but also intensified class consciousness. Strikes and labor protests were common, sometimes erupting into violent clashes with authorities. Meanwhile, regional movements demanded autonomy, further straining the central government's fragile hold on the nation. The Catholic Church, long intertwined with Spanish identity, viewed secular reforms and the expansion of workers' rights as an existential threat, while the military, accustomed to wielding immense influence, bristled at reforms that reduced its power. By 1936, compromise seemed impossible. Spain was a nation split down the middle, with each side seeing the other not merely as political opposition but as a mortal threat to the future of the country. The tipping point came with the general election of February 1936. The Popular Front, a coalition of leftist parties, narrowly won, igniting fear among conservatives, monarchists, and military leaders who believed the Republic's victory would accelerate social revolution. Within months, a group of army officers began planning a coup to overthrow the government. The conspiracy spread through garrisons and military bases, coordinated meticulously yet shrouded in secrecy, until July 17, 1936, when the first shots were fired in Spanish Morocco, signaling the start of the uprising. In some regions, the coup succeeded swiftly, with towns and cities falling under nationalist control. In others, resistance was immediate and fierce, as local militias, police units, and Republican supporters confronted the rebels, transforming the uprising into a nationwide civil war almost overnight. The initial days of the conflict revealed a grim truth: the Spanish Civil War would spare no one. Urban neighborhoods turned into battlegrounds, with machine guns and artillery echoing through streets once filled with ordinary life. Families were torn apart, with fathers and sons fighting on opposing sides. Summary executions, disappearances, and retaliatory killings became tragically common, as both Republicans and Nationalists sought to assert control and punish perceived disloyalty. The violence was not only military but deeply social. Ordinary citizens, caught between ideological factions, faced impossible choices: flee, comply, or risk death. Fear permeated daily life, and trust among neighbors eroded as suspicion and betrayal became survival strategies. In the villages of Andalusia, peasants took up arms to defend their communities, while urban workers in Madrid and Barcelona organized barricades and militias to resist nationalist advances. Every street, Every plaza, every home became part of a conflict whose scale and intensity neither side had anticipated. From the very beginning, the Spanish Civil War attracted international attention. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany viewed Spain as an opportunity to support a like-minded authoritarian movement and to test new military technologies. German planes bombed Republican-held cities, most notoriously Guernica, leaving devastation in their wake and shocking the global conscience. Franco's Nationalists received weapons, aircraft, tanks, and even soldiers from their allies, creating a stark imbalance in firepower. The Republicans, meanwhile, sought support from the Soviet Union, receiving arms, advisors, and some funding. Idealists from around the world, volunteers from Europe, the Americas, and beyond joined the international brigades, motivated by a belief that they were fighting fascism at its earliest stage. Yet, despite this support, the Republicans were hampered by internal divisions. Anarchists, socialists, and communists often clashed over strategy and ideology, undermining efforts to form a cohesive resistance against the more unified nationalist forces. Even in the midst of war, Republican-controlled areas became laboratories of social experimentation. Farms were collectivized, factories were run by workers' councils, and new social programs aimed to educate and mobilize the population. Women played prominent roles in both combat and administration, challenging traditional gender norms and demonstrating resilience under extreme conditions. Local governance and social services were reorganized according to egalitarian principles, reflecting a radical vision of what Spanish society could become. Meanwhile, nationalist zones emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and a return to traditional values. The Catholic Church supported Franco's cause, framing the conflict as a religious and moral crusade against the atheistic left, giving the nationalist campaign both ideological coherence and social legitimacy among conservatives. The war's early months also revealed the devastating human cost of modern warfare. Artillery barrages and aerial attacks did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. Refugees fled advancing fronts, leaving behind homes, farms, and businesses. Cities under siege faced starvation, disease, and destruction. Daily life became a test of endurance, as survival depended on navigating a landscape dominated by fear, violence, and uncertainty. Propaganda on both sides intensified, shaping public perception and deepening hatred. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and leaflets emphasized ideological differences, vilifying the enemy, and justifying acts of violence as necessary for national salvation or social revolution. By the end of 1936, Spain was fully engulfed in a war that showed no signs of slowing. The initial coup had failed to bring a quick resolution, and instead, the nation was divided into territories controlled by opposing factions. The Republican government struggled to maintain authority, facing both internal challenges and relentless nationalist advances. Meanwhile, Franco consolidated his leadership of the nationalist forces, coordinating military campaigns and securing foreign support that would prove decisive in the years to come. For ordinary Spaniards, there was little certainty beyond the relentless presence of death, displacement, and disruption. Communities, families, and the very fabric of Spanish society were irrevocably altered. The story of the Spanish Civil War was no longer just a story of politics, it had become a story of survival, ideology, and the struggle for the soul of a nation. The events of 1936 marked the beginning of a conflict that would shape not only Spain's future but also provide a grim preview of the global ideological battles that would erupt in the following decade. In this first chapter of blood and upheaval, Spain had crossed a threshold from political discord to full-scale war, setting the stage for a struggle whose consequences would reverberate far beyond its borders, touching the hearts and minds of the world. By the end of 1936, Spain had transformed from a country simmering with political tension into a nation fully engulfed in war, and yet the conflict was only beginning to reveal its true scope. The initial shock of the July coup had passed, and both sides began consolidating power, reorganizing their forces, and seeking ways to gain strategic advantage. The Nationalists, under Franco's emerging leadership, displayed remarkable discipline. With centralized command structures, strict hierarchy, and the backing of Italy and Germany, they rapidly fortified key positions and launched offensives aimed at cutting Republican territories in half. In contrast, the Republican side, despite controlling the capital Madrid and several other urban centers, suffered from fragmentation. Ideological infighting among communists, anarchists, and socialists complicated military coordination, while shortages of weapons, ammunition, and trained officers made sustained resistance increasingly difficult. Yet, the determination of Republican forces and volunteers from abroad gave hope that the fight for the Republic could continue. International involvement dramatically escalated the conflict, turning what had begun as a domestic struggle into a stage for global ideological confrontation. Hitler's Germany sent the Condor Legion, a specialized air unit, to aid Franco, introducing modern warfare techniques that would later influence strategies in World War II. Italian forces, too, deployed troops, tanks, and aircraft, providing both manpower and material support. On the Republican side, the Soviet Union supplied arms, advisors, and aircraft, though this support came with strings attached. Communist advisors often insisted on strategic decisions aligned with Moscow's interests, occasionally overriding local military priorities. Meanwhile, the international brigades arrived in waves, composed of idealists from Europe, North America, and Latin America, eager to confront fascism and defend democratic principles. These volunteers brought not only manpower but also a sense of international solidarity, embodying the belief that Spain was the front line in a global struggle against authoritarianism. The war's technological dimension became increasingly apparent. Bombings of civilian populations introduced terror as a deliberate weapon. Guernica, bombed in April 1937, became emblematic of this new kind of warfare. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated within hours, leaving hundreds dead and thousands injured. Images of the destruction circulated worldwide, shocking public opinion and drawing attention to the indiscriminate nature of aerial attacks. Beyond air raids, the war saw the use of mechanized infantry, artillery barrages, and urban guerrilla tactics. Front lines were fluid, and the distinction between battlefield and civilian space often disappeared entirely. Cities became fortresses, streets became trenches, and ordinary citizens found themselves pressed into service as fighters, medics, or messengers. Survival required constant adaptation, ingenuity, and courage. While the military dimension dominated headlines, the war also profoundly reshaped Spanish society in Republican areas. Workers' collectives took control of factories, reorganizing production to serve the needs of the war effort and attempting to implement egalitarian principles. Rural collectivization transformed agriculture in several regions, with communities managing farms collectively, sharing resources, and making decisions through assemblies. Education initiatives expanded, focusing not only on literacy but also on political awareness, aiming to cultivate a citizenry committed to democratic ideals. Women, in particular, assumed unprecedented responsibilities. They served in militias, worked in administration, and oversaw social programs, challenging centuries of entrenched gender norms. For many, the war was both a fight for survival and an experiment in radical social transformation, a demonstration that society could be reimagined even under conditions of extreme duress. Nationalist-controlled areas, in contrast, emphasized unity, discipline, and the restoration of traditional values. Franco's propaganda framed the conflict as a moral crusade against godless communism and anarchism, portraying the nationalist forces as protectors of Spain's cultural and religious heritage. The Catholic Church played a central role, providing both moral justification and practical support, including aid to soldiers and logistical assistance. Nationalist governance was authoritarian but coherent, decisions were centralized, strategies coordinated, and dissent ruthlessly suppressed. This contrasted sharply with the fragmented and experimental governance structures of Republican zones, highlighting the interplay between ideology, organization, and military effectiveness. By mid-1937, the war's social impact became more pronounced. Refugee flows swelled as civilians fled advancing nationalist troops or aerial bombardments. Cities under siege, including Madrid and Barcelona, experienced shortages of food, medicine, and fuel, exacerbating the human cost of the conflict. Hospitals struggled to cope with casualties, while local communities improvised shelters and relief efforts. Morale fluctuated dramatically. Victories in battle could inspire hope, but defeats or heavy bombardments often plunged populations into despair. In this context, ideology became both a motivator and a source of tension. Loyalty to one faction could mean survival, but disagreements within factions could lead to internal purges, arrests, or executions. The war demanded constant vigilance, forcing citizens to navigate a complex web of political, social, and military pressures. The international dimension also brought propaganda battles that extended far beyond Spain's borders. Media in fascist and democratic countries covered the war intensely, often presenting starkly different narratives. In Germany and Italy, state-controlled media portrayed Franco's forces as heroic liberators, while in Britain, France, and the United States, leftist publications highlighted Republican struggles and atrocities committed by nationalists. Artists, writers, and intellectuals engaged in the discourse as well. Pablo Picasso's Guernica, created in response to the bombing, became a universal symbol of civilian suffering in modern war. The Spanish Civil War, therefore, was not only a national catastrophe but also a global moral and ideological test, capturing the attention and emotions of millions around the world. By the end of 1937, it was clear that the war would not be brief. Both sides had endured months of brutal combat, social upheaval, and humanitarian crises. The nationalists' advantage in organization and foreign support was increasingly evident, yet Republican resilience, fueled by ideology, local knowledge, and international volunteers, allowed them to hold key positions. Front lines shifted slowly, and victories on one day were often countered by losses the next. The conflict became a war of attrition, with human suffering mounting, yet hope, determination, and ideological commitment continuing to drive fighters and civilians alike. The events of 1936 and 1937 demonstrated that the Spanish Civil War was far more than a domestic dispute. It was a proving ground for modern warfare, a clash of competing social visions, and an early battleground in the ideological struggle that would soon engulf Europe. The lessons were harsh and immediate. Unity, organization, and external support could decide the fate of armies and nations. Ideological conviction could inspire extraordinary bravery, yet also provoke internal divisions. Civilians, often the most vulnerable, would bear the heaviest burdens. As the war entered its second year, the stage was set for further escalation, and Spain's future hung precariously between the revolutionary experiments of the Republicans and the authoritarian ambitions of Franco's nationalists. By 1938, the Spanish Civil War had evolved into a grim test of endurance, strategy, and ideology. The initial shock of the coup and the early months of chaotic fighting had passed, leaving behind a landscape of destruction, exhaustion, and hardened determination on both sides. The Nationalists, benefiting from well-supplied armies and coordinated command, had begun systematic campaigns to consolidate control over strategic regions, while Republican forces struggled to defend fragmented territories. The war was no longer just a political struggle, it had become a battle for survival, where every city, river, and hill could decide the fate of thousands of lives. The psychological weight of the conflict was immense. Soldiers and civilians alike faced constant danger, hunger, and uncertainty. Families were divided, communities destroyed, and the very fabric of Spanish society strained under the relentless pressures of war. Yet, even amid despair, both sides displayed remarkable resilience, innovation, and ideological fervor that would shape the conflict for months to come. The Nationalists' military strategy in 1938 revealed their increasing sophistication. Franco, learning from earlier battles, focused on isolating Republican strongholds and cutting off supply lines, aiming to weaken opposition forces without unnecessary risk to his troops. The Aragon Offensive, launched in early 1938, exemplified this approach. Nationalist forces swept through northeastern Spain, capturing territory and severing Republican communication between regions. Cities and towns fell in quick succession, often accompanied by reprisals against suspected Republican sympathizers. These advances were aided not only by superior organization but also by foreign assistance. German and Italian aircraft and tanks provided decisive firepower, allowing Franco's forces to maneuver with unprecedented efficiency. At the same time, logistical coordination ensured that Nationalist soldiers were well fed, armed, and reinforced, in stark contrast to the increasingly desperate conditions facing their opponents. Republican forces, meanwhile, demonstrated both ingenuity and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite shortages of arms, ammunition, and trained officers, Republican commanders attempted bold counterattacks, employing guerrilla tactics, defensive fortifications, and rapid mobilization of militias. Cities such as Madrid and Valencia became symbols of Republican resistance, with civilians and fighters working together to repel nationalist advances. Urban barricades, makeshift trenches, and improvised defense networks allowed the Republicans to slow Franco's progress and demonstrate that even against superior forces, determination and strategy could yield temporary victories. International volunteers continued to bolster Republican morale and provide expertise in combat, though their presence also highlighted the ideological complexity of the conflict. The war was no longer purely Spanish, it had become a microcosm of the global struggle between fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. Social upheaval in Republican-held areas remained profound. While the front lines shifted, communities attempted to maintain collective systems implemented in earlier years. Factories continued to operate under workers' councils, agricultural land was farmed cooperatively, and educational programs persisted, albeit under extreme strain. Women played increasingly prominent roles, not only in militias but also in local governance, hospitals, and logistics. For many civilians, survival required ingenuity, rationing scarce food, providing medical care with limited resources, and navigating the constant threat of bombardment. The war blurred traditional roles and hierarchies, forcing ordinary people into positions of leadership and responsibility. Yet, internal political tensions persisted. Disputes between anarchists, socialists, and communists sometimes erupted into violence or sabotage, weakening the Republican war effort and complicating coordination on both military and civil fronts. The nationalist-controlled regions, in contrast, solidified authoritarian structures. Franco's leadership emphasized discipline, loyalty, and centralized governance, suppressing dissent while promoting ideological unity. Nationalist propaganda framed the conflict as a righteous mission to restore Spain's honor, cultural identity, and religious heritage. This narrative resonated among conservative populations, especially in rural areas and towns with strong Catholic traditions. The Church provided moral and practical support, while state-controlled media ensured that the nationalist perspective dominated in areas under Franco's control. The contrast between the experimental, often chaotic Republican zones and the orderly, authoritarian nationalist territories became increasingly stark, highlighting the ways in which political ideology directly shaped everyday life during wartime. The human cost of the war intensified in 1938. Bombardments, artillery strikes, and street battles continued to devastate urban centers. Refugee flows increased, with families abandoning homes, farms, and businesses to escape advancing troops. Hunger, disease, and exposure became constant threats, particularly in besieged cities. Hospitals were overwhelmed, often lacking basic supplies, while local populations improvised shelters, food distribution systems, and medical care. The psychological toll was immense. Children grew up amidst rubble and gunfire, adults faced impossible moral choices, such as whether to stay and fight, flee, or attempt to negotiate survival under enemy occupation. Fear and trauma became as pervasive as hunger, leaving long-lasting scars on survivors. International dynamics further complicated the war. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany not only provided material support but also used Spain as a testing ground for new military strategies and technologies. Bombing campaigns demonstrated the destructive potential of modern air warfare, foreshadowing tactics that would later define World War II. The Soviet Union continued to support the Republicans, but its involvement came with political strings, influencing internal power struggles and military strategy. Volunteers from around the globe remained active, yet they were increasingly aware that their efforts could not fully compensate for internal divisions and material shortages. The war's international dimension underscored Spain's position as a focal point for competing ideologies, a living laboratory for the global confrontation that would soon engulf the world. By late 1938, the tide was shifting unmistakably in Franco's favor. Nationalist offensives in Catalonia and the Aragon region left Republican forces exhausted and demoralized. Supply lines were cut, communication became fragmented, and the morale of both soldiers and civilians declined sharply. Even successful counterattacks provided only temporary relief, unable to alter the overarching trajectory of the war. Despite this, Republican resistance remained symbolically powerful. The fight for Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia inspired both domestic populations and international observers, emphasizing the moral stakes of defending democracy against authoritarian aggression. The persistence of Republican forces, even in the face of mounting losses, highlighted the intersection of courage, ideology, and desperation that defined the conflict. Amid military operations, political developments continued to shape the war. Republican leaders sought unity, attempting to reconcile differences among anarchists, communists, and socialists to present a cohesive front. Negotiations were fraught, with ideological disagreements often translating into logistical and strategic failures. Nationalists, by contrast, leveraged ideological cohesion to streamline decision-making and maintain focus on long-term objectives. The contrast between political fragmentation and centralized authority became a decisive factor in determining the effectiveness of each side, with clear implications for the war's eventual outcome. As 1938 drew to a close, Spain was a nation exhausted by prolonged conflict, yet still fiercely engaged on multiple fronts. The human toll was staggering, hundreds of thousands had died or been wounded, millions displaced, and entire regions devastated. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure was shattered, and societal norms were radically altered. Yet, within this devastation, both sides demonstrated remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and commitment to their respective visions of Spain's future. The Spanish Civil War had become a crucible, testing military skill, ideological conviction, and human endurance. By the end of this chapter, it was evident that the conflict's conclusion remained uncertain, with every victory and defeat carrying profound consequences for the nation and for the world watching closely. By early 1939, the Spanish Civil War had reached its devastating conclusion, and the country that had once been a vibrant mosaic of political ideals, social experiments, and regional identities now lay fractured and exhausted. The Nationalists, under Franco's decisive leadership, had achieved overwhelming military superiority. Months of systematic offensives, coupled with superior logistics, foreign assistance, and the political cohesion of their forces, allowed them to press relentlessly against Republican territories. The last Republican strongholds, including Catalonia and Madrid, faced relentless bombardment, shortages of food and ammunition, and collapsing morale. Civilians and fighters alike confronted the grim reality that defeat was imminent, yet even in these final stages, acts of resistance and courage continued to shape the narrative of the conflict. The fall of Catalonia in February 1939 marked a symbolic and strategic turning point. Barcelona, once a hub of Republican experimentation, political debate, and international attention, succumbed to the combined pressure of nationalist ground forces and aerial attacks. Tens of thousands of civilians fled across the French border, creating one of the largest refugee crises in Europe at the time. Entire communities were uprooted, and families were separated, forced to navigate treacherous terrain and uncertainty to seek safety. Meanwhile, those unable or unwilling to flee faced reprisals, imprisonment, or execution. Franco's forces, emboldened by their victories, executed systematic purges of political opponents, dismantling anarchist, socialist, and communist networks that had flourished in Republican zones. The political and social transformation that had characterized Republican territories was ruthlessly dismantled, replaced by centralized authority, censorship, and repression. Madrid, the capital, had already endured years of siege and bombardment, and by March 1939, its fall was imminent. Despite sporadic resistance, internal divisions within the Republican government weakened defense efforts. Some leaders, anticipating inevitable defeat, attempted negotiations with nationalist commanders, hoping to preserve lives and retain limited political influence. These efforts, however, were largely ignored by Franco, who sought complete control and the elimination of opposition. For the residents of Madrid, the final days were marked by fear, deprivation, and uncertainty. Food shortages, disrupted communications, and constant military presence transformed the city into a tense and constrained environment. Even as the war neared its conclusion, civilians continued to demonstrate resilience, providing aid to wounded fighters, maintaining essential services, and attempting to preserve fragments of daily life amidst chaos. The military conclusion of the war was both swift and brutal. Nationalist offensives combined ground assaults, coordinated artillery, and precise aerial bombardments to eliminate pockets of Republican resistance. Republican forces, exhausted, poorly supplied, and demoralized, offered limited resistance. Large-scale surrenders occurred, but Franco's administration treated these with calculated severity. Officers, political activists, and prominent figures associated with the Republic were imprisoned, executed, or exiled. Entire neighborhoods and cities were purged of leftist influence, and the nationalist regime began establishing mechanisms to ensure long-term political dominance. This systematic approach underscored Franco's strategic vision. Victory was not merely territorial but ideological, aiming to reshape Spain according to authoritarian, conservative, and nationalist principles. The human toll of the conflict was staggering. Estimates suggest that nearly 500,000 people perished, though the true figure may have been higher when considering executions, civilian casualties, and deaths resulting from disease and starvation. Millions were displaced, forced to flee to France, Portugal, or other safe havens, while countless others faced imprisonment or forced labor. Urban centers were in ruins, with critical infrastructure destroyed, and the economy was severely weakened. Industrial production had collapsed, transportation networks were disrupted, and agricultural output was insufficient to meet the population's needs. Spain's social fabric had been irrevocably altered, with communities divided along ideological, regional, and political lines. Trauma and grief permeated daily life, leaving a generation shaped by war, displacement, and loss. International reactions to the end of the war varied widely. Fascist regimes in Germany and Italy celebrated Franco's victory as a triumph against communism and socialism, using Spain as a propaganda tool to promote their own ideological agendas. Conversely, democratic nations expressed concern over the humanitarian crisis but largely refrained from intervention, constrained by the policy of non-intervention that had dominated much of the conflict. The Soviet Union, which had provided assistance to the Republican cause, faced a political setback and public scrutiny over its limited influence in determining the war's outcome. Meanwhile, the experiences of the international brigades became a symbol of the global ideological struggle, highlighting both the commitment of volunteers and the limitations of external support in shaping domestic outcomes. The war, therefore, concluded not only as a national tragedy but as a demonstration of how international politics, ideology, and military capability intersected on Spanish soil. With the cessation of hostilities, Franco moved quickly to consolidate power and establish a regime that would endure for decades. Political parties were banned, censorship implemented, and opposition silenced. Regional autonomy, which had flourished briefly under the Republic, was eradicated, replaced by centralized governance and a strict emphasis on national unity. Education, culture, and public life were reshaped to promote conservative values, loyalty to the regime, and traditional Catholic beliefs. The apparatus of repression, police forces, intelligence networks, and military tribunals ensured compliance, creating a climate of fear that permeated daily life. Yet, Franco's regime also emphasized stability and order, promising security and reconstruction after years of turmoil. For many Spaniards, this offered a grim sense of relief. The war was over, and survival, however constrained, was once again possible. The legacy of the Spanish Civil War extended far beyond the borders of Spain. The conflict provided a preview of the tactics, alliances, and ideological struggles that would define the global confrontation of World War II. Germany and Italy tested military innovations, such as aerial bombardment and mechanized warfare, refining techniques later deployed in Europe. The international political discourse surrounding the war highlighted the challenges of intervention, neutrality, and ideological alignment in a polarized world. Moreover, the war served as a moral and cultural touchstone, inspiring art, literature, and political reflection for decades. Works such as Pablo Picasso's Guernica, written accounts by journalists, and memoirs of combatants and civilians preserved the memory of the human suffering, resilience, and complexity of the conflict. The Spanish Civil War became not only a national trauma but a lens through which the world examined the consequences of ideological extremism, political fragmentation, and the human cost of modern warfare. By the summer of 1939, Spain was officially under Francoist control, and the country faced the daunting tasks of reconstruction, reconciliation, and survival. Cities needed rebuilding, agriculture required reorganization, and millions of displaced individuals sought refuge and security. The social experiments of the Republican era had been dismantled, leaving behind a society fundamentally altered by years of ideological struggle, violence, and upheaval. Yet, beneath the surface of repression, memory persisted. Families told stories of courage and loss, communities mourned those who had perished, and the scars of the war shaped Spanish identity for generations. In this way, the Spanish Civil War left an indelible mark, not only on the political and physical landscape of Spain but on the consciousness of its people and the collective understanding of 20th-century conflict. The war's conclusion offered no easy resolutions. While Franco's victory established a stable authoritarian regime, it came at the cost of immense human suffering, social fragmentation, and the suppression of democratic ideals. Spain entered a long period of isolation and control, its trajectory shaped by the consequences of the conflict and the ideological rigidity of the Francoist state. Yet, the story of the Spanish Civil War remained a powerful reminder of the consequences of political extremism, the resilience of human communities under pressure, and the complex interplay of national and international forces in shaping history. The final chapter of the war closed with the country physically unified but morally, socially, and psychologically scarred, a nation grappling with the long shadows of its recent past.